Subtopic: Empirical evidence for the demographic transition. Explanation: rapid population growth is a temporary phenomenon. If fertility fell in lockstep with mortality, we would not have seen an increase in the population at all. The demographic transition works through the asynchronous timing of the two fundamental demographic changes. The decline of the death rate is followed by the decline of birth rates. This decline of the death rate followed by a decline of the birth rate is something we observe with great regularity and independent of the culture or religion of the population. The chart presents the empirical evidence for the demographic transition for 5 very different countries in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. In all countries we observed the pattern of the demographic transition: first a decline of mortality that starts the population boom, and then a decline of fertility which brings the population boom to an end. The population boom is a temporary event. In the past the size of the population was stagnant because of high mortality. Now country after country is moving into a world in which the population is stagnant because of low fertility. Explanation: England and Wales's demographic transition. Perhaps the longest available view of the demographic transition comes from data for England and Wales. In 1981, Anthony Wrigley and Roger Schofield 11 published a major research project analyzing English parish registers, a unique source that allowed them to trace demographic changes for the 3 centuries prior to state records. According to the researchers, England is exceptionally fortunate in having several thousand parish registers that begin before 1600. Collectively, with their early start and breadth of coverage, these registers form an excellent resource. As far as we know, there is no comparable data for any other country up until the mid-18th century. See the following section for Sweden, where record keeping began in 1749. The chart shows the birth and death rates in England and Wales over the span of nearly 500 years. It stitches together Wrigley and Schofield's data for the years 1541 to 1861 with 2 other sources up to 2015. Click on the Charts Sources tab for details. As we can see, a growing gap opens up between the birth and death rate after 1750, creating a population explosion. Around the 1870s, we begin to see the third stage of the demographic transition. As the birth rate starts to follow the death rate's decline, that gap between the two starts to shrink, slowing down the population growth rate. Explanation: Sweden's demographic transition. Zooming in on one of these countries, we take a look at Sweden's demographic transition. The country's long history of population record keeping starting in 1749 with their original statistical office, the Tabellverket, Office of Tables, makes it a particularly interesting case study of the mechanisms driving population change. Statistics Sweden, the successor of the Tabellverket, publishes data on both deaths and births since record keeping began more than 250 years ago. These records suggest that around the year 1800, the Swedish death rate started falling, mainly due to improvements in health and living standards, especially for children. Yet while death rates were falling, birth rates remained at a constant pre-modern level until the 1860s. During this period and up until the first half of the 20th century, there was a sustained gap between the frequency of deaths and the frequency of births. It was because of this gap that the Swedish population increased. The following visualization supports these observations. Subtopic: Changes to birth and death rate over time around the world. The visualization presents the birth and death rate for all countries of the world over the last 5 decades. You can see the changeover by moving the slider underneath back and forth or by pressing the play button. Countries per continent can also be highlighted by hovering and clicking on them in the legend on the right side of the chart. By visualizing this change, we see how in country after country the death rate fell and the birth rate followed. Countries moved to left-hand side first and then fell to the bottom left corner. Today, different countries straddle different stages of the model. Most developed countries have reached stage 4 and have low birth and death rates, while developing countries continue to make their way through the stages. Subtopic: How development affects population growth. There are 2 important relationships that help explain how the level of development of a country affects its population growth rates. fertility rate is the parameter which matters most for population changes. It is the strongest determinant. As a country gets richer, or more developed, fertility rates tend to fall. Combining these two relationships, we would expect that as a country develops, population growth rates decline. Generally, this is true. In the visualization, we see how the population growth rate has changed for more developed, less developed and least developed countries, based on UN categorization, and how they are projected to change through 2099. Here we see that population growth rates are lowest in the most developed regions, starting at just over 1% in the 1950s and falling to just 0.19% today. Less developed regions peaked later, at a higher growth rate, 2.55%, and have declined more slowly. Least developed regions did not peak in growth rate until the early 1990s. Over the last 2 decades we have seen declining population growth rates in countries at all stages of development. Subtopic: Population momentum. Explanation: if the number of children is not growing, why is the population still increasing? In 1965 the average woman on the planet had 5 children. 50 years later this statistic, called the total fertility rate, has fallen to less than half. The first panel in this chart shows this fundamental change. The total fertility rate at which a population replaces itself from one generation to the next is called the replacement fertility rate. If no children died before they grew up to have children themselves, the replacement fertility rate would be 2. Because some children die, the global replacement fertility rate is currently 2.3 and therefore only slightly lower than the actual global fertility rate. Why then is global population growth not coming to an end yet? The number of births per woman in the reproductive age bracket is only one of 2 drivers that matter here. The second one is the number of women in the reproductive age bracket. If there were few women in the reproductive age bracket, the number of births will be low even when the fertility rate is high. At times when an increasing share of women enter the reproductive age bracket, the population can keep growing even if the fertility rate is falling. This is what demographers refer to as population momentum, and it explains why the number of children in the world will not decline as rapidly as the fertility rate. The second chart in this panel shows that the population growth over the last decades resulted in increasingly larger cohorts of women in the reproductive age bracket. As a result, the number of births will stay high even as the number of births per woman is falling. This is what the bottom panel in the chart shows. According to the UN projections, the 2 drivers will cancel each other out so that the number of births will stay close to the current level for many decades. The number of births is projected to change little over the course of this century. In the middle of the 21st century, the number of births is projected to reach a peak at 143 million and then to decline slowly to 131 million births by 2100. The coming decades will be very different from the last. While the annual number of births increased by 43 million since 1950, we are now close to what the late Hans Rosling called the age of peak child, the moment in global demographic history at which the number of children in the world stops increasing. How close we are to peak child we looked at in a more detailed post. Population momentum is one important driver for high population growth. But it of course also matters that all of us today live much longer than our ancestors just a few generations ago. Life expectancy is now twice as long in all world regions. In all of this, it is important to keep in mind that these are projections, and how the future will actually play out will depend on what we are doing today. Subtopic: How does migration affect country populations? At the global level, population changes are determined by the balance of only 2 variables: the number of people born each year, and the number who die. At regional or country levels there is a third variable to consider: migration into, immigration, or migration out of, emigration, the region/country. How large of an impact does migration have on population changes across the world? In this chart we see the annual population growth rate under 2 scenarios: population growth rate with migration. This includes the balance of births, deaths plus migration. A hypothetical population growth rate if there was 0 migration, i.e. it is based only on the balance of births and deaths. The example shown here is the United States, but you can explore this data for any country or region using the Change Country button on the interactive chart. In the United States we see that since the early 1950s, migration into the USA has exceeded emigration out of the country. This means net migration has been positive, and resulted in a higher population growth rate than would have occurred in the scenario with zero migration. In 2015, for example, the actual population growth rate was 0.68%. With zero migration, this would have been 0.38%. This is also true for most countries across Europe. In fact, population growth would have been negative, i.e. the population would have been in decline, in Europe since the early 1990s without migration. In 2015, the European population increased by 0.17%, with no migration, it would have decreased by 0.02%. The opposite is of course true for countries where emigration, out of the country, is higher than immigration. Take Nepal as an example. In the mid-1990s its actual population growth rate has been lower than it would have been in the absence of migration. In 2015, its growth rate was 0.66%. With zero migration it would have been 1.43%. Population momentum is driven by the increasingly large cohorts of women in the reproductive age bracket. It's only when both the fertility rate and the number of women level off that population momentum stops. And this is when global population growth will come to an end. Hans Rosling explained it better than anyone, with the help of toilet rolls.